Hi, everybody. As Stefan mentioned, I'm a librarian. I've been working on kind of the science policy interface um, for probably 15 plus years, going all the way back to the kind of the last kind of conservative government here in Canada, which wasn't so great for science. And that's kind of how I got involved in this project that we're kind of moving forward on. And so the thing is building a library for the science of policy, right? And so the first thing I think of is building a library for science and policy. How about building a library for the policy of science? And how about working on science for the library of policy, or even for to indulge my librarian side, a policy for the library of science. I guess these are all kind of possibilities here, and these are kind of the things that are at the back of my mind to kind of help me envision something a bit wider and more generalized. And now we're early days on this project, working really with Yanir to figure out where we want to go with this, how we want to define it, what outputs might look like, what inputs might look like. And the general idea is that there are policy relevant questions where we want to kind of create a generalized protocol or platform to gather and organize information in such a way that will help policymakers make good decisions or make good policies, or at least better decisions and better policies. So what are kind of the research questions here for me that we're kind of going forward on? And so in kind of a generalized frame, I can think of for any given policy relevant question, what different kinds of evidence can be gathered to make the case to policymakers? In other words, what counts as evidence? And another question is, how should that evidence be organized and presented to maximize the chances of it being accepted and policies and better policies implemented? In other words, really how to change people's minds. And so we're kind of working on a kind of a case study assumption here of a policy relevant question. Healthcare workers should wear respirators in at least clinical and patient facing settings. So, and we've all, it's always handy to have a kind of a something a bit concrete in your mind to help you with kind of formulating the general questions. And so what kind of evidence, what would count as evidence in that process of convincing healthcare policymakers to implement these kinds of mask wearing policies? And not just and so the idea is not just clinical research or randomized controlled trials, but also physics, chemistry, aerosol science, engineering, material science, technical standards, even kind of media articles and explainers, right? And how should that evidence be framed and presented to persuade policymakers and practitioners, for example, to start wearing respirators in these clinical settings? And this is really coming from kind of psychology research in a way, right? Motivated reasoning. And we can think of the work of Katharine Hayhoe in climate change and her work convincing evangelicals, working with evangelicals. And she uses the language of shared values and stewardship, right? So that's kind of a framing that she uses to help people see the evidence that's there. And we have lots of evidence that masks work, but hardly anyone, even so many healthcare experts, seem to accept it and be willing to kind of live that evidence. And I guess there's two ways of looking at this, right? There's that positive framing. Here's the evidence. Let's figure out how to make sense of it together and move forward. There's also kind of a negative framing that we see in a lot of these things, right? Where for example, the healthcare policymakers are exposed to misinformation and disinformation about the effectiveness of masks. For example, that famous Cochrane Library systematic review from a few years ago
30
about
seconds,
masks out
John.
there. And so you always hear it, masks don't work, right? Uh, and so there's that kind of same range of different kinds of evidence that could be used for this debunking, and a range of this kind of the way you could present this kind of counter evidence. That's a positive or negative framing in a bunch of areas, right? You could think of climate change and other things. And there's also the recent CSA standard that was implemented on recommending mask use in healthcare. That's an interesting idea, a technical standard recommending mask use, but it's not law, it's not regulation. So see how this plays out in Canada with this new Canadian standard. And so we're, like I said, we're the early stages of this. What do we need to explore? What are kind of the outputs that we're looking at? We need to dive into that psychology research on changing minds. There's that weirdly philosophical side of what counts as evidence. We need to explore the case studies, positive versus negative framing. We need to come up with a platform for housing the evidence and the science policy documentation and case studies. We need to define how these evidence documents will be presented and organized within the library. And we need to kind of define the research question output document, what that library looks like, what kind of platform it will be. And we need to figure out how to get these summaries or whatevers in front of the policymakers. And so that's kind of where we are. Now, as you see, I didn't use slides here. If people want to kind of remember what I said, I do have pretty detailed notes, and I'd be happy to share those detailed notes with people.